Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work.
Jonathan?
Simon.
Yes.
How are you?
Can you hear me well enough?
I can hear you perfectly clear. Can you hear me?
Yes. Now, we're using this mic, but I'm thinking to myself that if we can both hear you...
Today's podcast is the first of a three-part series on phone supervision. In parts 1 and 2, I speak with Simon Feuerman and Melissa Groman, licensed clinical social workers, clinical supervisors and consultants, and the founders of the new Center for Advanced Psychotherapy Studies, or NCAPS. NCAPS was established in 2006 as a learning program for licensed clinicians from all training and theoretical backgrounds to learn together without geographic limitations. Simon and Melissa are two of a growing number of clinicians who use accessible and affordable telecommunications and internet technologies to eliminate traditional barriers to supervision, including geographical distance, time constraints, and lack of local clinical experts. In today's podcast, Simon and Melissa talk about the similarities and differences between face-to-face and phone supervision, advantages and disadvantages, the difference between clinical supervision and consultation, existing research on phone supervision, and some thoughts about approaches to phone supervision. In the second episode, we continue our discussion and we talk about the mechanics of actually participating in phone supervision, how to set up phone supervision as the supervisor and the supervisee. We also talk a little bit about risk management and some of the benefits of ongoing supervision or consultation for clinicians who have already obtained their advanced clinical license and are considered independent practitioners. In the third episode, I interviewed Jody Bechtold, whom regular listeners will recognize from the ever-popular series on pathological gambling, which can be found at the Social Work Podcast website. Jody and I spoke about her experience receiving phone supervision as she worked towards becoming a nationally certified gambling counselor. My interview with Simon and Melissa was a first for the Social Work Podcast. It was the first time I interviewed two people at once, and the first time I interviewed someone outside the studio. Today's interview about phone supervision was recorded using, what else? The telephone, or at least the 21st century version of the telephone, Skype. Skype is software that enables people to communicate for free computer to computer. And I wanted to acknowledge the technical support of David Holtzimer and the staff at the Faculty Instructional Development Lab at the University of Pittsburgh for figuring out how to set up Skype so that I could do this interview. And now, on to the podcast with Simon and Melissa about phone supervision. So I suspect that almost all of our listeners have had experience with face-to-face supervision. I was wondering if you could tell us what some of the similarities and differences are between face-to-face and phone supervision.
Of course, Jonathan, the process of supervision, the mechanics of it are the same no matter what medium you use. What you do find is that in phone supervision, there may be a tendency, paradoxically, to have it be more formal, since there really is nothing else to distract you. You're really dealing with the issues that come up in your mind, and they're really answering the questions. There's a lot of time that's spent in face-to-face supervision on things that come up in a sort of free-floating way, and both for good and for bad. Also, if we're talking about students or we're talking about professionals who are working in agencies, there's a lot of chit-chat that goes on in casual settings that are supervisory. Even though the phone would seem like a less formal way of communicating, since all you do is pick up the phone, you don't have to go anywhere, our experience bears out the idea that it actually may be more formal and more focused, since there really isn't anything else extraneous. You get on the phone, you talk about a case, and all of that cognitive and emotional energy is focused on the issue at hand.
One difference between phone supervision and in-person supervision can be, for a lot of folks, convenience. You can call in, there's no commute time, there's a certain ease about it, particularly with group supervision over the phone. One of the best bonuses of group supervision is that you can access colleagues and people and different personalities that you would never have access to if you were limited by your own geography. So that is a real bonus. Over the phone also, there is a tendency, like Simon was just saying, to focus more. There's a very strong need to be understood. And it is very helpful on the phone to connect with people who are really interested in understanding each other and in gaining more depth and insight into the work. Not necessarily to be given technique or skill enhancement, although that certainly happens and new ideas are always generated. But I think people have a real desire to feel effective. And over the phone, you can really be free to say everything, especially if it's facilitated in a very warm and positive and collegial atmosphere. So I think those are some of the benefits.
So it sounds like, in terms of similarities and differences, most of the things that you've mentioned sound like similarities to face-to-face, with the exception of the convenience of having it be remote.
That's true. There is one critical difference, though, which really even though it seems like a very sophisticated human endeavor, supervision, it really derives from actually very primitive, and I don't mean in a pejorative sense, but primitive experiences early on. Winnicott talks a great deal about the supervision as being a form of the early mothering and the holding environment. And what he refers to in that sense is the verbal cueing that goes on between mother and infant.
What we've experienced in our own work on the phone together and with the colleagues that gather with us on the phone is that when you don't have the sense of sight and you don't have the transferences that come immediately from when you see somebody, the other senses kick in. And it's a very wonderful experience to see how you can relate to voices, how the use of silence, the use of sensitivities, and all these other senses kick in and become highly focused. And it's something that's just different. I honestly can't tell you whether that's a better thing or a worse thing. I can tell you that it's a fascinating thing. It does encourage people to come forward more and to be able to say more because they're not relying necessarily on eye contact or facial expression. They have to ask, what are you experiencing now? What is this silence about? How am I feeling right now? And they have to come forward. So it leads to a connectiveness.
That's really interesting. So you're saying that because people have to listen more closely, they have to rely on clarifying with others what exactly is going on for them in that moment, that there's something about phone supervision that is not perhaps better or worse, but is just different than face-to-face.
That's correct.
What are some reasons that a social worker would want to use phone supervision?
Well, convenience is the very first thing that comes to mind, and that's what has been reported to us from a number of people. The travel time that it takes in urban areas and certainly in rural areas to get from one place to another, the decompression time, if you will, from getting out of the office, going to somebody else's office, being on a bus or in a train or a car, it just saves many, many hours, and it's directly in the place of your work often. And therapists they're calling from their offices often when they're doing a call. So it does have that, really convenience is it. That's what it seems to be.
Well, I would also add accessibility to people that you wouldn't otherwise know. I think that for me personally, that has been one of the most stimulating and interesting pieces of the work, which is that I have gotten to meet people from all over the country and from different countries who I would never have access to. And I think it's amazing what the universe sends in terms of people being in your path to connect with and learn with and grow with.
What would be some of the disadvantages to phone supervision, both for the person who's the supervisor and the supervisee?
The obvious deficit here is in the sight, is on the phone traditionally, although now with the advent of webcams and all other kinds of technology, we may be repairing that deficit. But the fact is that people really do seem to want, as a function of their desire, is to see. And they see people's expressions and they see the beauty of other people. And that seems to be what people desire. And the first contact they have with the idea of phone supervision is often one of deprivation. I'm going to be deprived of something that I'm used to. I'm going to be deprived of my sight. Now, whether that really has a bearing on the effectiveness of the experience is another matter. But people do love to see.
As you were saying that, Simon, I wondered if there is a natural selection process for folks who are willing to participate in phone supervision, that the folks who you talk with in your phone supervision are people who are more willing to forego that visual cue. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I'm going to just address that. I would like to say that I'm not sure, but one of the things that we've discovered is that people that are interested in supervision in general are also interested in phone supervision. And that the barrier doesn't necessarily seem to be phone supervision. The barrier seems to be supervision at all. So those folks that choose to do some phone supervision are also interested in learning about themselves and accessing supervision in general.
I wonder if there's some piece to phone supervision that, as this gets researched and investigated more in the future, that it will suggest something about different types of learners having more comfort level or more success with different types of supervision, either face-to-face, webcam, chatting, like text-based, or just over the phone, auditory.
Yeah, Jonathan, you're correct that we're at the very beginning of the research that's being done on the specific kinds of supervision and perhaps the different personalities and proclivities that would bring a person to be successful in one form of supervision versus another.
So during my research for this interview, I came across a number of different approaches to supervision. For example, Baltimore and Crutchfield mentioned 3 models of supervision, each based in a different theoretical perspective, client-centered, behavioral, family systems, for example. In the client-centered model, the supervisor assumes that the supervisee has all of the resources that he or she needs to actively address whatever issues are being discussed in supervision. And in contrast, the behavioral model assumes that insight is less important than meeting goals and objectives and using punishment and rewards to change the supervisee's behavior. I'm wondering what approach you take to supervision, and if you think that one approach is better suited for phone supervision than another.
Jonathan, I'm reminded, I was smiling as you asked this question because I'm reminded of the old Woody Allen joke, inflation and depression, how to dress for each. And the idea here is that you look at these 3 models and they seem to conflict with one another. They have very different ideas about what supervisees need and what they want and what would be effective. The answer in understanding some of these models is that each one is a different experience for a different time. It could even be for the same person, but at a different time in their career. One of the great analysts, Hyman Spotnitz, talked about why we don't use the same technique in psychotherapy, even in classical psychoanalysis, with the patient. And what he talked about was, it's kind of an analogy, but he didn't mean to be sexist. He actually used it for both sexes. Is this if a man relates to a woman in the same way every day, it doesn't work. Same way if a woman relates to a man. He must use different techniques with the very same person. So the idea here, when you talk about the different models, what we found experientially is that people are coming to us at a more developed stage, for the most part. And what they really would like is not the behavioral model. Certainly, it would not be appealing to them. They do not want to be told techniques. They do not want to be meeting goals and objectives. They really want to talk, they want to connect, and they want to be understood. Occasionally, they want to be exposed to a new idea. And that happens, that's interspersed along with the supervisory or the sessions that we have, the group sessions, is new ideas do come about since they are populated by people really of vastly different orientations across North America, the United States and Canada. So it's really that's very, very stimulating. But primarily, they really do want to be understood. That's what we find.
So perhaps the style of supervision is more of a function of what your supervisee's needs are versus the medium through which the supervision is being provided.
Yes, that was very elegantly put. That's exactly what it is.
Thank you. Melissa, did you have something to add to this?
I would only add that in some of the more traditional models, the supervisee needs something from the supervisor in terms of technicality. They need licensure, they need instruction, and we don't tend to work on that model. A lot of the things that motivate people to come and talk are a desire to know themselves, to know their clients better, and to feel effective and to feel like they're doing good work. And the way to access that and to talk about it is through an exchange and is through a dialogue. So it's not a directive model, although certainly as Simon was speaking about, there are techniques and there are many new ideas that get generated, but it's not in a corrective or directive sense. It's through the connection and through the development of community and exchange.
So just hypothetically speaking, let's say you received a request from somebody who had just graduated with their MSW. They're out in some rural area, and they're looking for clinical supervision towards their clinical license. Is that something that you think would be well served by phone supervision, or would you suggest that they seek somebody face-to-face?
Well, certainly in terms of process, it's absolutely well served through phone supervision, but the first stop in that question is always the law and ethical mandate of the state. So a lot of times each state has specific guidelines through their local social work boards that dictate exactly what will qualify as supervision towards licensure. So if it's in sync with the state requirement, then absolutely there's not an issue.
Do you know of any states that that require individual supervision to be face-to-face?
It's certainly a number of states require face-to-face supervision. There are many states that don't, and many states require only individual supervision, and many states really have no opinion as to whether it's group supervision or individual supervision. It is absolutely variable state by state.
I would also add that it also depends on your discipline. The guidelines for clinical social workers and marriage and family therapists and clinical psychologists can vary from state to state as well.
Part of this discussion is what is allowed under the law in terms of supervision, and anybody who's out there listening to this podcast would be well advised to check with your local licensing board before engaging in phone supervision if you need it for your licensure or if it's part of your license to have face-to-face supervision. But this also brings up another issue which is related. It has to do with risk management and liability. And part of risk management is, in fact, receiving clinical supervision. However, there are liabilities associated with providing supervision. Specifically, if your supervisee is sued or is part of a lawsuit, then the supervisor can be held liable for, say, inadequate supervision. As someone who does phone consultation and supervision, how do you address issues of liability and documentation of supervision sessions?
That's a great question. I want to just say that there are two I think mandates for supervision. One is internal and one is external. And at lower levels of licensure in most states, the mandate for supervision is external. Lower level licensees are not permitted to practice without supervision. And that is a very different kind of supervision than internally motivated supervision, where one can, by the nature of the law and the nature of the ethical guidelines from the national boards, one can practice autonomously and never have to discuss a case with anybody. So that kind of supervision, where one doesn't have to by law, is really a different kind of supervision, and that supervision is more of a consultation supervision. So in terms of how we work and in terms of directiveness, one doesn't come to consultation supervision with a case and receive a direct suggestion, guidance. These suggestions that come up are ideas that are generated and are not mandates for action. The nature of our work is consultation. It's very, very different than the work that I do with folks who don't have their second-level clinical license, where the nature of the work is that the supervisor is absolutely accountable for the cases and the actual interventions that go on with the client.
So I think this is interesting because I think this is all speculative, but let's say you had somebody who was receiving administrative supervision at their agency, but not clinical supervision. Do you think that phone supervision across state lines, if it was legally allowed, do you think that that would be something that you could recommend that somebody should do in order to receive that clinical supervision if it wasn't available face-to-face in their area?
Well, as you said earlier, the accessibility to experts or to a specific relationship that a social worker or another clinician would feel would be beneficial to them for a specific reason, and they could access that over the phone, I think would be wonderful. And a lot of agencies, particularly in New Jersey, do not provide clinical supervision. They provide only administrative supervision. So a lot of people that don't have their second level licensure, their clinical license, do have to seek outside supervision. The law is face-to-face hours. I think that in New Jersey it specifically states that. So for those folks that are looking for supervision towards licensure, or that even aren't. I know a lot of social workers that aren't interested in a clinical license. They like where they're working. They're not allowed to work legally under the guidelines of the state board unless they have a clinically licensed social worker supervising their work. So they have to seek outside supervision. And in fact, in New Jersey, the state board goes to great lengths to specifically train licensed clinical social workers to do supervision for licensed social workers.
As we get more information about the benefits of phone consultation and phone supervision versus face-to-face, I wonder if there are going to be any changes in policy around that. I can imagine being the director of a community mental health clinic in a rural area and really wanting to contract with somebody who is an expert in a particular disorder or problem area that could provide regular phone consultation with my staff on these issues, even towards licensure. Do you think that that might happen in the future?
Absolutely. But what we find more often than not, and it continues to amaze us, is that people seem to be driven by desire rather than need. It seems that for the people that this would make logical sense for, as in the good case that you mentioned, a person in a rural area who's a director of a community mental health clinic, for whatever reason, the people that seem to gravitate towards phone supervision are motivated by desire rather than logic or regulation or legislation or need. It was very surprising to us, but that's been our experience.
And along those lines, do you know of any research that supports the use of telephone supervision? If so, is there research that says that it's less than, equal to, or more effective than traditional face-to-face supervision?
We have found very scant evidence on the different forms of supervision as there are on the different forms of treatment, including phone treatment and treatment that's now done by the web and by chatting. There are a number of organizations that do this and do cite research, but it is very new. So what we found was, and in most situations, you actually try something and it works, and then you figure out why it worked. And that's really been our experience, is that we found that it worked astonishingly well based on the reports of the people that were involved in it. And what they cited was that they really had a new understanding, and they felt very present on the phone during the experiences of the supervision. They felt very understood to a degree perhaps some even suggested would not have been possible in face-to-face supervision. What they cited, again, was just like in treatment, what we want to do is facilitate an experience where they're free to say everything. And some people felt more comfortable to say what they needed to say on the phone than they did in person. This was very surprising to us. I do want to add, though, that when I thought and meditated on the issue more deeply, and I looked back at really going back to ancient sources, really ancient sources, there's discussions in the Talmud as to which is a person who is more deprived, the person who is a deaf mute or the person who is blind. This is analogous to the supervision experience on the phone where you don't see. So this may seem arcane, but it struck home because in the early experience of the infant, again, what you go back to is, and I see Melissa is shaking her head, I always go back to the early experience, but the fact is that the early experience does seem to be auditory. Although the eyes do work, the mind doesn't comprehend what the eyes see. So the infant early experiences are through sensations and through auditory experiences. And that seems to bear out in a backwards fashion, in a retroactive fashion, why it does seem, anecdotally at least, to work so well. Because the auditory kicks into overdrive, the auditory senses, and it seems to compensate and give the person an ability to really focus and enjoy, if you will, what's going on.
I think we're very early in the development of the field of phone work, and it's going to take some time for empirical evidence and research to really show itself. And it's also, in terms of measurability and factors that one can use to evaluate, like anything else, it's very subjective evaluation because the work we do is based on feeling and impression and transferences. It's not necessarily based on measurable fact. So as much as I would like to say that there is some sort of proof one way or another, it is subjective and it is experiential. So it's really up to whether it appeals to a particular person or not.
So this concludes part one of the two-part interview with Simon and Melissa about phone supervision, and the first of three in our three-part series on phone supervision, which includes the interview with Jody Bechtold. Please join us for the next episode, where we continue our conversation with Simon and Melissa about other experiences with phone supervision. And that episode, as well as all the others, can be found on the Social Work Podcast website. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.